Rhode Island Share and Deposit Indemnity Corporation. Our commitment to protecting your savings is carved in stone.
Well, the human impact was just terrible. People had their life savings all frozen. Perhaps the hardest hit group of all were all the so-called little guys and little gals who had businesses.
So there was a lot of anger on the part of the depositors, almost all of it justified. And there was a lot of fear too. I mean, you go to your ATM at your credit union and it doesn't work. And your checkbook doesn't work either. You can't write checks because your money is frozen.
What happened with RISDIC is that the presidents of the various financial institutions were controlling RISDIC. And RISDIC was supposed to be examining those institutions for safety and soundness. That created a basic conflict of interest. When some of the institutions started to fall on hard times, when loans went out that shouldn't have gone out, when crimes were committed that shouldn't have been committed, and the financial institutions started to become shaky, RISDIC covered over and did not do an adequate job in examining the banks to expose their true financial situation so something could be done about it. Because they covered it over, the situation continued and got worse.
I would say that the situation was as bleak a public situation as I have ever seen, long-lasting, with enormous amounts of pain and suffering and uncertainty and loss over months. It's not like you had a bad day. This is you had a bad half a year. And the whole state had that bad half a year. And what Governor Sondland did was try to use that to fix as many things as possible. And he had the courage to do that, and he had the vision to do it, he had the determination to do it. It didn't always make him popular.
When I became Attorney General, my first role was to establish a white-collar crime unit. So the unit began with state police on it, law enforcement from some of the municipalities. I hired Bob Stitt, who was a retired Wall Street lawyer who had done a lot of work in the banking industry. Charlie Black, who was on loan from the IRS, and other people who had served in a variety of capacities. Even when I looked at those credit unions themselves, even if I just looked at the four walls, they didn't seem capable, really, of sustaining the kinds of loans that, in fact, they were giving. They were not asking for any personal guarantees from the people who were borrowing the money. They were actually giving it to a corporation that could go belly up tomorrow. And nor did they have any other collateral. These loans were being given for the purpose of building something, but if they ran out of money, you'd have like a half a building, which was hardly a good collateral for the loans. I sat down with Bob Stitt and Charlie Black and said, am I missing something here? Take a look at this. And what's wrong with this? So at that point, we'll find out for your boss. They came to the meetings, they started studying it, and eventually it led to the Stitt report. RISDIC, of course, was the Rhode Island Share Indemnity Corporation. They were the equivalent of what the FDIC is under federal law. What they're supposed to do is, if there was a credit union failure, they were supposed to have enough money in the pot that they could come forward and make sure that the depositors were repaid, at least their principal that were on deposit at that particular credit union. As we began to study this, RISDIC certainly did not have the money. They also were advertising at that time, which was somewhat misleading. Cast in stone, your money is protected. They couldn't protect one of any of those 5 credit unions that we were looking at, let alone if all of them potentially failed. And we had lots of reasons to believe that those individual credit unions were on the cusp of failure. Well, the first people that we wanted to present this to was the governor, because we felt it was critically important that we have his support. We were also very concerned that any of the information would be leaked to the public, because if the public got any inkling that any one of these financial institutions were having solvency problems, that in and of itself could cause a run on these credit unions. People would start withdrawing their money, and bingo, there would be a collapse of any one of these credit unions. I felt that the governor did not really take it to heart. To me, I don't think it was just coincidence that they were campaign contributors to the governor, as well as the leaders in the General Assembly.
I think the point is well taken, Bob, that if the withdrawals proceed and accelerate, there will come a point in time where there is no liquidity.
I would also submit that there are 13 or 14 extremely well-run private insurers in this country, and that RISDIC, in fact, leads the nation with the kind of deposit insurance and the kind of protection and the kind of leadership that they have provided over the years. I'm rather not go on because I think others are going to make that point.
Well,
I hate to be...
Okay, Bob, just to point out, I'm not questioning RISDIC and its ability. However, the one underlying thing that fundamentally bothers me is whenever the fox is left to guard the hen house. You must admit that most of the, not most, I think all of the members, or many of the members of the RISDIC board are also serving in some capacity with the credit union.
We may, in fact, be seeking a solution that, in fact, denies us of a very favorable available resource.
But isn't the issue not how many options you have, but how many viable options you have? All Representative Gashin's bill is stating is that when you have a situation where a private insurer who has available $25 million, and they in fact have outstanding risk of $1.2 billion, when you have that on the one hand...
I understand those figures, and I've been asking for... He said that the ratio was the same entire nationwide.
But sir, the difference is that if there is an excessive demand, which is the word of art, on a given institution...
And that's taking care of lines of credit, just like we go across the state line for lines of credit every day in the week.
Because the line of credit, sir, except for $400,000, must be secured by tangible assets.
People knew this was coming. Bob Stitt had written a report. The Attorney General's office had received it. That report had gone up to the General Assembly, and the Speaker and other people had been provided this information. And it was all very well established. If you went down to the Department of Business Regulation to ask the examiners, they would kind of reluctantly say, oh yeah, it is that bad. So this was a known thing, but because the players involved were politically connected, friends of people, and for other illegitimate reasons, the political system didn't react. It just, I don't know what they were thinking, that this was going to go away. I think with Governor DePrete, he was thinking, well, I'm at the end of my tenure, let this be somebody else's problem, showing us nothing but the taillights on his Winnebago. For the legislative leadership, a lot of them got thrown out by the voters in the next election. I don't know what they were thinking, not taking this on.
And it always struck me as to why couldn't the politicians see this? The pain was palpable. And how did we get to a point where your own self-interest blinds you to other people and their need for compassion and their need for you to take action? I was just hoping against hope that the care and concern for those depositors would supersede this incestuousness between the folks who were the political insiders. Regrettably, it did not.
So we did not anticipate the collapse. It wasn't until about Thanksgiving of 1990 that this issue started to get up on our radar screen. The big issue at the time was resolving what we knew was going to be a major budget deficit. And so we were focused on that primarily. The governor also had a very ambitious public works program and a very ambitious agenda. He was a Franklin Roosevelt Democrat, and the economy was in a downturn, and he had to learn from President Roosevelt that the best way to put people back to work was to put them to work building things. And so that was what we were primarily focused on.
And somebody called in and said, hey, these guys from RISDIC and Reichul want to come in and see you. They've got a concern that there may be a public relations problem. And in came these two guys, one from RISDIC and one from Reichul, and they had this story to tell about how there might be some misunderstandings and we might have to, count on everybody's discretion about the problems and that everything was going to be fine, but we couldn't be rash about what we said about any of this and so forth. And it all stank. It all had a really bad odor. It was completely obvious that something very bad was hidden under all of this, and I went immediately to Governor Sondland and to the more senior members of his team and said, I don't know exactly what's going on here, but we've got something very, very sketchy, and it could be very, very bad.
So we had an ambitious 100-day strategy, and when this broke, the credit union crisis consumed the 100-day strategy. And dealing with this in a constructive way, in a productive way, became the 100-day strategy. So we had to figure out a way to resolve this, and at the same time, we had to solve the largest budget crisis on a percentage basis in the United States.
A new governor comes into office with a whole slate of ideas and initiatives that they want to accomplish, full of optimism and enthusiasm about accomplishing their goals, and then pow, this thing hit. And it was so much bigger than anything else. It just completely dominated the politics, the news, people's conversation, the state's emotion. It was like a knockdown slam in a windstorm. And this was actually Inauguration Day. And I'd been up basically the whole night at the local law firm that was helping us with the legal work, preparing the papers to close the credit unions. Because the day before, the chairman of RISDIC had called me and said, we have just put ourselves into receivership. We have just gone out of business. As soon as businesses open the next business day, they'll be uninsured, they'll have no coverage, and basically, we've pulled the plug.
We turn now to the story of what happens when a bank's insurance system fails. Last week, government regulators warned that the federal bank insurance fund could run out of money by the end of the year unless something's done to build it up. These days, anyone looking for an extreme example of what happens when a deposit insurance system falls apart need look no further than the state of Rhode Island. Business correspondent Paul Salmon did that and has this report.
Today, now, on behalf of all the depositors, especially the small depositors, I am declaring a bank emergency in Rhode Island.
On New Year's Day, Rhode Island woke up to this announcement. The state's bank insurance fund was broke.
And I can remember right before the inauguration at the governor's house on Benefit Street, the people going by on the street below, there were well-wishers coming to see them. There were crowds going by. It was kind of a celebratory night. People were happy. The night was full of light and laughter and conversation and voices and footfalls, and it was a wonderfully happy scene of bodies and people and cheerfulness. And there were probably a dozen of us who knew what was going to happen. And it was the eeriest feeling to look out at all that joy and all that happiness and know that in a couple of days, the state was going to be turned upside down.
For angry depositors, frustration reaches an all-time high. They want their money back, and they want it back yesterday.
I remember one case where a gentleman sank every penny he had into opening up a restaurant, and he needed that last bit of money out of his credit union to buy the plates and the knives and the forks. But he couldn't get the money. So he couldn't then pay, quote unquote, the nut on the loan that he had gotten to open up this restaurant, and he eventually had to file bankruptcy. To me, it was so obvious the pain that the depositors were in, because this crisis hurt them to the nth degree. Some committed suicide. They lost their businesses. They didn't know where their savings were going to come to them so they could have a modicum of retirement.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Ken Malloy. We begin with what is perhaps the largest and most vocal protest yet by depositors who want their money freed up from closed credit unions. Thousands upon thousands of them took to the streets in Providence today, marching, protesting, yelling, and at one point burning an effigy of Governor Bruce Sunland. News Watch 10's Jody Kennedy has more.
It was one of the biggest turnouts, which began with a pledge.
For the sake of our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren, we will never give up the fight until we get all of our money.
A public leader faced with the kind of group fury that Governor Sunland experienced, has some choices themselves. And what Governor Sunland did that I think was a lesson to all of us was, first, he was willing to let people have at him. He didn't hide. He had town hall after town hall. A lot of the town halls were initially called Dome on the Roam, Capitol Dome on the Roam. And of course, the staff quickly called them Bruce on the Loose. But he would go and he would be yelled at. And I think he understood that when people are really upset, sometimes they need to yell for a bit. And if you're patient with them when the yelling's done, then you can begin to have the conversation that they need.
And the meetings all had a very, very similar dynamic. I mean, it was uncanny how there was almost a script for these things. And in the first hour, it was just rage. It was anger. It was that special kind of rage when you're angry, but you're also afraid too.
Ladies and gentlemen, the governor of the state of Rhode Island, the Honorable Bruce Sunland.
If you're scared off by their yelling, then you never get to that conversation. And one of your roles as a public citizen, a public leader, is when a citizen has been hurt and is suffering, you need to hear them through their anger and then see what you can do. But if you haven't heard it first and aren't willing to sit there and be yelled at for a while, you have a little bit defected on your job. So he was totally willing to do that.
I have never run away from a meeting in my life. I don't intend to run away from this one.
Just because your adversary, who appears to be your adversary, is red hot mad, is no reason not to engage. You've got to let them have their anger. They earned it by being screwed. And now they are entitled to yell at you as the governor And your job is to sit there and take it and get through it and then work to try to solve their problem. And the second is you can't let it affect your judgment. You can't let whether somebody's being nice to you or mad at you affect the substance of the decisions that you have to make to try to make it right.
Public leaders in Rhode Island did many, many things that were correct and actually very helped resolve the problem once the problem was identified. First, you had the willingness to ask for help. And there was a direct line that went up to the FDIC, to the Fed, to the National Credit Union Administration, seeking help in a proactive way to stem the what everyone was afraid would be riots and disasters of people demanding their money, and if they couldn't get their money, then you would have a complete and total collapse. In 1991, I was the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation's Assistant Director in charge of investigating the causes of every bank failure in the U.S. And after that, I transitioned to handling 3 of the largest financial institution failures in the country that needed my special attention. In 1993, I got a call from a fellow named Dick Gaskell. Dick was a former FDIC official and had been tasked with heading up Rhode Island's DEPCO, the Depositors Corporation, that was charged with cleaning up the credit union crisis here in Rhode Island. Dick asked me if I would come up and help with the specialized investigations required for professional liability investigations. Officers and directors, accountants, lawyers, and special service providers. The DEPCO situation had a lot in common with other bank failures, credit union failures, and savings and loan failures throughout the country. Basically, what you had in almost every situation was a convergence of a declining economy, but the institution generally was pushed over the edge by negligent operations and, in many cases, fraud, criminal activity, and in some instances, organized crime. So there was nothing different that went on here in Rhode Island and the credit unions than happened everywhere throughout the country, with one exception, and that was Rhode Island's unique deposit insurance situation. RISDIC was the state insurer, and you did not have a state insurer in everywhere else in the country. FDIC took care of that. Joe Mollicone was the poster child for the Rhode Island deposit insurance crisis. Actually, his institution, Heritage, was a very, very small player. And if Heritage had failed and the system in Rhode Island was sound, there would not have been a crisis. Joe Mollicone was an individual who owned Heritage Savings and Loan, and he inherited that actually from his father, so it was a family institution. The difference between Joe Mollicone and his father, Puppy Dog Mollicone, is that loans that Puppy Dog made were paid back and loans that Joe made were not. And when a loan isn't paid back, you see where that goes, and the institution failed. At the same time, Joe was trying to keep it quiet, trying to keep a lid on everything, and his flair for the dramatic was just what the newspapers wanted. He disappeared from sight the day after his daughter's wedding. No one knew where he went, and when people started to look into what was going on, they discovered that Heritage was basically insolvent. But again, Heritage was a small player in the RISDIC system. If many, many other institutions had not been on the brink of failure, Heritage would have caused nothing. The other human element there is that you had service providers to the banks, and people depended on those service providers, such as the accountants. You had one accounting firm supposedly looking and checking at the financial statements of RISDIC, And at the same time, they were supposedly looking and checking at the financial statements of the major players in the RISDIC system. Those financial statements were misstated. In addition to that, you had lawyers who were providing services to the institutions, who again were profiting in a very direct way. And you also had appraisers. Appraisers would go and look at a property, and if they were supposed to appraise a house for a loan and they didn't indicate that that same house had been sold back and forth 5 or 6 times in the last 3 months, inflating the price at each sale, that can create a problem. So what you had was an unfortunate convergence of service providers to the institutions, in addition to the officers and directors in the institutions themselves, who were all working towards the same end, and that was covering over a situation, not doing the job that they should have been doing, and keeping the institutions safe and sound. Well, ethics, accountability, and oversight have to start at home if you're a public servant and if you're a public leader. Unfortunately, in Rhode Island in the 80s and before, there was a climate of acceptance of corruption, public corruption, and public officials who ultimately, many of whom were indicted, or public officials who were continuously elected, and everyone knew with a wink and a nod that they weren't conducting the most ethical operations in their positions. So ethics, accountability, and oversight have to start at home. You need politicians who have the courage to maintain an ethical line and who are willing to be proactive to do their job.
If you look backwards at this looming problem and what people knew and what people failed to do, that was a very educational thing, and it was an education that came with a lot of emotion, because we had to clean up this mess, and we had to deal with a lot of people who were suffering a lot, and none of that suffering was necessary if the public leaders at the time had done their jobs in any kind of an honest or responsible way. So how not to do it was a very powerful example from looking back. Looking forward, we had Governor Sondland, who was fearless, dead honest, and willing to empower his staff in remarkable ways. He trusted us, even let us make mistakes, knowing that if we all kind of hunkered in, we were never going to get this done. He had to let us have a little bit of freedom to run and to make mistakes, and then as a team, we'd do better if he led us that way and just kept like the throttle forward on get it done, get it done, get it done. He used to say, how fast would you do it if the Russians were in Attleboro? The staff was very young. I mean, I was 35. A lot of them were younger. And we had this incredible emotional roller coaster ride and incredible, like, just massive, like, crushing for an all-nighter test, only for 4 months in a row, all happening at once. And out of all of that came a sense of loyalty among each other that is still a very profound feeling in my life.
And it was really a testament to the governor's leadership ability in a team-picking perspective, that he was the great general manager. He put folks in a position where they could excel and help make the team become a champion. That really is something I think of the governor every day, some lesson in life or human nature, or some phrase that he said that I learned from and I still apply.
When you have a crisis, you have 2 ways to approach it. Number 1 is problem resolution. Oh, there's a crisis. I'm a government official. Let's clean it up. In this case, the Rhode Island leaders actually did a very good job in conjunction with the federal government. But let's look at the other side of the coin, and that's proactively identifying where are problems coming down the pike so we don't have a crisis and we don't have to clean it up. And unfortunately, that's where we have to be very proactive to, in the context of ethics and accountability, to make sure that everyone is doing their job.
With Governor Sunden's leadership and persistence, and by taking advantage of not just this solution, but looking broadly at other things that were wrong and using this opportunity to begin to move them in the right direction, it was the most consequential year in Rhode Island history, probably since the Dorr Rebellion. And if you look back at that period and evaluate Rhode Island today, you see that enormous amount of what we think of as the baseline of how Rhode Island works, whether it's how we appoint judges, how our workers' compensation system works, how our budget is run, how our banking system works, how our legislature manages financial issues, whether there are hearings. A lot of that came out of the aftermath of this particular crisis.
Public leaders should learn what the expression public servant means. It's all about the public and serving their needs. It shouldn't have anything to do with your own self-aggrandizement, your own self-promotion, your own re-election. You're a public servant. Serve the public by doing what is right. I can only hope that people that are the millennials of today, when they think of public service, that they go back to the original concept, which is you come into government for a certain period of time, you do your darndest to help the public and make this a better place than the way you found it, and then leave. But leave, for heaven's sakes, with empty pockets.
What the average citizen can do to avoid a reprise of the RISDIC situation is express themselves at the ballot box, make their views known, and to not tolerate public corruption or an air of public corruption. One other thing they can do is require their public officials to proactively look, where is the next crisis coming from? What is my generation's crisis going to be? How is it going to manifest itself? Our public leaders are in a position to look for that, but the public has to require them to look for it and to keep their feet to the fire.
Well, there you are, a citizen. You're going on about your life. You have no reason to believe that the bank that your life savings is in isn't sound. You have no reason to believe that the insurance company advertising on the TV how carved in stone it is a sham. And suddenly you find all this out. Where does your faith at that point go?
To be honest with you, I assumed it was insured. I mean, it's on all my bank accounts. There's a big sign on the door, insured, you know, and I never really thought about, I never realized that there was a difference between federally insured or RISDIC, that, it says insured. Insured to me is insured. I mean, I just never expected, anything like that.
And I think over and over again, they present us the choice as citizens. Do we lose faith? Do we get angry? Do we say to hell with the system? Or do we say something really bad went wrong there and we need to figure out what went wrong? We need to make sure that doesn't happen again and kind of own it in that sense rather than having it encourage us to move away from active citizenship. Make sure that it's a spur to more active citizenship, even in your anger, even in your frustration, even in your disappointment. And if you look around and see that people aren't doing their jobs faithfully, and that there's too much relationship, too much politics, and not enough looking for the horizon and steering a true course, then that's a real problem. And that was the ultimate problem in this case, that the legislature and the people who had a chance to do something about this wouldn't do it because these people who were looting the credit unions and propping up the sham RISDIC outfit were their friends, were their donors, were their political chums, and they simply didn't want to call foul on their own buddies. And that is and ought to be unacceptable.
Regrettably, citizens today have to be the sentinels of democracy. We are all called to public service when you come right down to it, whether you're officially in office or not. I think the citizen of today not only then has to be vigilant, but also should see their responsibility too of making this a better world.